He failed chemistry 3 times. By senior year, people at Whitney High School had already decided what kind of future he deserved. But the same boy everyone laughed at was about to stop a disaster that none of the top students in California knew how to handle. And when the truth about his life finally came out, the entire school went silent. Whitney High School in Cerritos, California looked perfect from the outside. Ivy-covered science buildings, polished hallways, Teslas and Range Rovers lined across the student parking lot like success itself had an assigned parking space. At Whitney, students talked about Stanford the way most people talked about weekend plans. Failure didn't belong there, but James Cook knew better. He had spent the last 3 semesters walking those halls with exhaustion sitting behind his eyes like something permanent. He knew which teachers had already given up on him. He knew which students posted jokes about him online after every chemistry test. He knew exactly how long people stared at a red 42% before pretending not to look anymore. And every morning, before first period even started, James sat in the back corner of AP Chemistry quietly rewriting notes nobody believed were helping him. Not because he was forced to, because he was trying. Sharon Fielding noticed that before anyone else did. She had taught chemistry at Whitney High for nearly 15 years. Students feared her exams, respected her intelligence, and avoided disappointing her whenever possible. She was a kind of teacher who could tell within 5 minutes whether a student had studied or simply memorized enough to survive. And James confused her. His test scores were terrible, but his notebooks weren't. His equations were messy, but his scientific reasoning was advanced. Sometimes he asked questions so sharp they caught even Sharon off guard. Then the next day he'd fail another quiz like he had never understood the material at all. She didn't know yet that James Cook was fighting battles no classroom could measure, or that one rainy night in California was about to force her to see the truth. Before we go any further, if you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever worked twice as hard just to stand in the same room as everyone else, this story is going to stay with you to have my voice still find a home in your heart. Hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and which part of the story hit you the hardest. I believe this story found you today for a reason. Now let's continue. It was a Thursday morning. Quiet, warm, the kind Southern California morning where sunlight spills slowly across campus buildings before most students are fully awake. Palm trees shifted gently outside the science wing. Sprinklers clicked across the football field. Somewhere near the student parking lot, music drifted faintly from an expensive car with the windows down. From the outside, Whitney High looked exactly like what parents dreamed about when they moved to Orange County. Competitive, prestigious, untouchable. Inside room 214, James Cook was already exhausted. He was 17 years old, wearing the same dark hoodie he wore almost every morning, finger stained faintly from permanent marker and grocery inventory ink. He had been awake since 5:30 helping his grandmother before catching the metro into Cerritos. By the time Sharon Fielding walked into AP Chemistry carrying a stack of graded exams, James already knew what was coming. The classroom quieted. Papers shuffled. Then Sharon stopped beside his desk. A giant red 42% stared up from the front page. Nobody laughed loudly. Whitney's students were usually too polished for that. But James still heard the whispers, the low murmurs, the quiet little sounds people make when they've already decided who you are. James folded the paper carefully and slid it into his backpack without saying a word. What nobody inside that classroom understood was this. James Cook wasn't losing to chemistry. He was losing to everything waiting for him after the final bell rang. And by the end of that week, Whitney High School was about to discover exactly what that meant. When the final bell rang that afternoon, students rushed toward football practice, beach plans, and coffee runs. James Cook walked in the opposite direction. Most students barely noticed him as they crossed the Whitney High parking lot, laughing beside shiny Teslas and Jeep Wranglers. James kept his hood up and his backpack tight against his shoulder as he headed toward the metro station 2 blocks away. By the time he reached Lakewood, rain had started falling across Southern California in thin silver streaks. Trader Joe's glowed under fluorescent lights like the only thing still awake in the city. Inside, James was already unloading produce crates from the back delivery truck. His movements were careful but slow. Exhaustion clung to him. His hands looked raw from cardboard edges and cleaning chemicals. Every few minutes he rubbed his eyes hard like he was fighting to stay conscious. That was exactly how Sharon Fielding found him. She had stopped for groceries after grading chemistry exams late at school. She almost didn't recognize the boys stacking apples near the freezer aisle. At Whitney High, James always looked quiet and distant. Hey, he looked older. Not physically, just worn down in a way teenagers weren't supposed to be. Then she saw him step outside during break. Rain tapped softly against the store windows while James stood under the awning holding his phone close. "Grandma, did you take the insulin?" he asked gently. No, I already ate. Don't worry about me." Sharon froze beside the checkout aisle. James listened quietly for a moment, then smiled tiredly into the phone. "I'll bring your medicine home after shift. Okay." And suddenly everything about him made terrible sense. The sleeping in class, the shaking hands during labs, the empty look behind his eyes. James Cook wasn't lazy. He was surviving adulthood while still trying to survive high school. There are kids sitting in classrooms all across America carrying responsibilities nobody sees. Some are working night shifts. Some are raising siblings. Some are trying to survive long enough to dream. And sometimes the difference between a student giving up and a student changing the world is one person choosing to notice them. If stories like this still matter to you, stay with this one. By Monday morning, Whitney High School was buzzing about the California State Science Challenge in Pasadena. Students crowded around lab tables talking about scholarships, recruiters, and competition rankings like their futures depended on it. For most of them, maybe they did. And right in the center of all that attention stood Ethan Parker. Confident smile, perfect grades, expensive watch peeking beneath his blazer sleeve, son of a biotech executive from Ovine. Teachers loved him because he looked exactly like success was supposed to look. Then Ethan unveiled his chemistry prototype. Sharon Fielding felt her stomach tighten almost immediately. The filtration design, the pressure calculations, even the handwritten reaction sequence on the display board. She had seen all of it before in James Cook's notebook sitting on the corner of her classroom desk weeks earlier. Across the room, James noticed too, but he said nothing. He just lowered his eyes while teachers crowded around Ethan praising his innovation. The silence on James' face hurt worse than anger would have. Like disappointment was something he had already learned to live with. Later that afternoon, James quietly told Sharon he was thinking about dropping out of the competition altogether. "People like Ethan always win," he muttered. Sharon looked at him for a long moment. Then she said softly, "You've spent so long surviving that you forgot something. James, surviving is proof you're stronger than most people in this building." 3 days later, Pasadena felt like another world. News cameras lined the university auditorium. Students from elite schools across California moved between lab stations wearing pressed uniforms and confidence James couldn't fake. Then the chamber malfunctioned. Smoke burst upward. Pressure alarms screamed through the lab. Students backed away in panic while teachers froze trying to understand what was happening. James moved first. He spotted the unstable compound immediately, recalculated the pressure imbalance in seconds, then stabilized the reaction before the chamber ruptured. Silence swallowed the room. Near the back stood billionaire biotech investor Daniel Whitmore staring directly at him. "How does someone fail chemistry 3 times and still do that?" he asked quietly. James answered without looking up. "Because failing something and understanding it aren't always the same thing." By morning, the video was everywhere. TikTok, Instagram, local news stations. And for the first time in his life, James Cook woke up impossible to ignore. By the next morning, Whitney High School didn't feel like the same place. News vans lined the street outside campus. Students who used to whisper about James Cook now stared when he walked through the hallway. Teachers suddenly smiled too quickly at him. Even the administration looked nervous. James looked overwhelmed by all of it. Inside the packed school assembly, Principal Ortega carefully congratulated the science team while avoiding mention of James' academic record. The hesitation hung awkwardly in the room until Sharon Fielding finally stood up from the front row. Her voice cut through the auditorium clean and sharp. Some students arrive here with private tutors, fully stocked labs, and 8 hours of sleep every night, she said. James Cook arrived carrying grocery bags, overdue bills, exhaustion, and responsibilities most adults would collapse under, and he still kept showing up. The room went completely silent. Students lowered their eyes. A few teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. And for the first time, people at Whitney High stopped looking at James like a failure and started looking at him like a human being. Even Ethan Parker sat quietly, the confidence gone from his face. Not ashamed exactly, just aware now of how different their starting lines had always been. Later that afternoon, reporters crowded around James outside the science building. One of them asked softly, "What did failing chemistry teach you?" James paused before answering. That people are quick to measure your grades because it's easier than measuring your struggle. By evening, the clip had spread across TikTok, Instagram, and national news pages. Some people watching this story right now were probably told they weren't smart enough, talented enough, or worth believing in. Maybe you're still carrying words someone spoke over your life years ago. But stories like James Cook's remind us that human beings are bigger than their worst season. And if that truth means something to you, carry it forward with this story. 2 weeks later, Daniel Whitmore returned to Whitney High School personally. Standing before the entire auditorium, he announced a full scholarship for James, a paid biotech internship, and a statewide mentorship initiative in his name. The entire room rose to its feet. James looked toward Sharon, fielding through the standing ovation. No speech passed between them, just quiet gratitude. And somehow, that meant more. Whitney High School once remembered James Cook as a boy who failed chemistry 3 times. But California would remember him differently. Not as a failure, not as a statistic, but as proof that sometimes the strongest people are the ones carrying burdens nobody ever bothered to ask about. If you love this story, don't just scroll away. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and which part of the story hit you the hardest. We've got more powerful, emotional stories coming your way. And trust me, you don't want to miss them.